Good morning, gentlemen. We're on the 59th segment of Think Before You Speak series. The laws of Shemirat Halashon with clarity with a few stories. Leilu Nishmat, the Hafetz Chaim, Zechet Tzadik Lebracha. As well, Leilu Nishmat, Luz Aliza Bat Hanriet, and our children that passed in the fire, Ruach Hashem Tenichena Began Eden. These halachot should be a great zechut for the Refuah Shlema of Yitzchak Ze'ev, Betikva Naomi, Avi Mori, Yitzchak Nisim Beluna. As well for Eliyahu Rachel, and as well for the young boy, Yaakov Yisrael, Ben Tamar Malka, Ori Mordechai Ben Simchia, with all the cholim of Klal Yisrael. Hashem should be merachem in the zechut of these laws of Shemirat Halashon. These laws of Shemirat Halashon should be a zechut for our Bnei Chabura, for Shefa, Ben Achav Hatzlacha B'lidai, and specifically it's dedicated for the Shmira Ma'aliyah and the Hatzlacha Gdola of Chaim Davido Ben Chai Sarah. Today's halachot titled Avoiding Blame. Now, I want you to think back. This is a wonderful chidush that I think when you hear these halachot, it'll stop us for a moment and say, really? I want you to think back to a time when you were looking to buy a house. I know that there are some wonderful families in this community that when they were looking to buy a house, they actually kept the nap that they take Shabbat afternoon into consideration for the buying of the house on a specific block. They were looking for a block that's quiet, that there's no ball playing, there's no bicycle riding Shabbat afternoon, because they wanted to enjoy the oneg of Shabbat and the beauty of Shabbat, of the way Shabbat should look like with a good nap. And because of that, our story begins. On one day, a neighbor comes walking out and walks right past another neighbor in a huff. And the second neighbor turns to the first neighbor and says, Mrs. So-and-so, you look a little bit upset. Is everything okay? And she says, I'll be honest with you. You know, when I moved onto this block, I really thought that Shabbat afternoon I'd be able to get a good nap. Me and my husband, we cherish that little Shabbat afternoon sleep. All week we're running crazy and working our hearts out. Shabbat is the day of rest. And recently, the kids on this block, Shabbat afternoon, they're playing ball, they're running and screaming in the street. We cannot sleep. Where are the parents? How come the parents aren't saying anything to these kids? They know it's Shabbat afternoon. They know people love taking naps on Shabbat afternoon. And yet they let their kids just run around and do whatever they want and make the racket and the noise that they're doing. It's not right. Well, the second neighbor who's listening is thinking to themselves, she's probably talking about my kids. But my kids do not run around on Shabbat. I actually have my kids go to sleep on Shabbat, as we do as well. I know whose kids she's talking about. She's talking about down the block's kids. At that moment, could the second neighbor defend her own children and turn to the upset neighbor and say, listen, I know who you're talking about. You're talking about this and this family down the block. Their kids are all over the place. My kids, they're angels. Is she allowed to say that in defending her own kids and avoiding blame? The halacha states that even if somebody's accusing you of wrongdoing and they're wrong, you're allowed to avoid blame by only saying, it wasn't my kids. My kids go to sleep on Shabbat. But you're not allowed to say whose kids it really was. And this is true not just for the scenario of the story, but any time someone comes and blames you for something you didn't do. You're allowed to avoid blame by saying, it wasn't me. But you cannot, to save your own self, say who it was. If you are to step up and say it was somebody else, and I'll tell you who it was, to convince you that it wasn't me, that is forbidden and Lashon Hara. And therefore, if at any time a person is put into a position where they were being blamed by somebody else, and they were kind of confronted and asked, who did this? You're allowed to say only, I did not do it. It wasn't my kids. It wasn't me. But to come across and say who it was, that is absolute Lashon Hara. Now, if by you telling the person it wasn't you, they could deduce who it really was. Because the people who are coming now on the offense are assuming that it was one of two people, let's say. And the moment you say it's not you, by process of elimination, they basically figure out it must be the other person. So now by you saying it wasn't me, you're kind of leading on to the fact of who it was. The halacha says you are still allowed to defend yourself and say it wasn't me. Even if they're going to extrapolate and deduce by process of elimination who it was, you didn't say it. And you're allowed to say, me, it wasn't. And that's it. They figure out who it was from that comment. That's not your issue. And that's not Lashon Hara. And it's permissible to avoid blame and say, it wasn't me. I just want to end off this halacha with something that we generally don't do. This series is built for halachot, to get a clarity in the laws of Shemirat Halashon. That's why we go with the stories, so that you can not only understand the halacha, but you can put yourself in the halacha. Place yourself in the story. These stories happen all the time, especially when it comes to avoiding blame. But this is the one time that I want to mention that there is a lifnim mishurat hadin to this halacha. That means that there is something that one could go above the letter of the law and be extra special. We find a lot of times in the Gemara that great pious men, great rabbis, when they were blamed for something they didn't do, they just stayed quiet. And they took it. They were willing to take the blame for other people in order to spare the other people who are really guilty embarrassment. I'm not telling you to do this. This is very pious. This is a high level. But I do want you to know that when you take the bullet for somebody else and you're selfless, your relationship with God is the exact same way. Thank you for listening.